Welcome back to the Ink Sync. I am Annie, and this is the publishing podcast for the rest of us. You're hearing me because we are still on break, and we are playing you all some of our favorite episodes from this year, from Season 1. And Season 2 will be coming into your earpieces sometime in February. We will keep you all updated. In the meantime, here's one of your faves from this year. Welcome back to the Ink Sync. I am Annie.
I'm Kaylee.
And you are listening to the publishing podcast for the rest of us. Whew.
What a time.
I'm going to cut out everything that came before this, so please know that it took us several tries to do that today.
Somehow, we've seemed to have gotten worse. We've just gotten worse.
We're professionals.
We do this for play money.
We did this for $0.
Yeah, I just want to be very clear. Money. Annie gave me a Coke Zero.
I did.
That's how I've been paid for my time.
Your time, your beautiful soul, your effort, your presence, your labor.
I will happily share my pickled radish with you later, Annie, if you would like some. I ordered sushi.
Oh, I was like, what are you talking about? This has gone off the rails, and we literally just...
Good. I want to give you something to remember later.
Awesome. Okay, so, Kaylee, before we jump into the news, I want to chat with you about some feedback that we got about a question that we had about the difference between Dungeon Master and Game Master. So it's a trend that we've noticed that lately, streamers specifically, but a bunch of other groups have gone with Game Master instead of Dungeon Master, and so we wondered aloud and to each other if there was something specific that had happened that caused this trend, and no one knows the answer. I had a couple people message me with theories, actually. One of them is that when we were kids, Dungeons and Dragons was basically the only game in town for tabletop role-playing, and now there are more options, and with those more options comes different language options and people, getting used to a different way of speaking. Other people say it's regional, and that on the West Coast, people are more likely to say GM, and also that people on the West Coast, or if you're a streamer, you're more likely to be located on the West Coast, so that would have helped it spread more because they're streamers more publicly. I don't know which one my guess is it's probably some combination of a million factors, and it's just if you are streaming Dungeons and Dragons, you probably play other role-playing games too, and you just probably use them interchangeably.
And I'm sure there's transition-wise before tabletop gaming and such like that was more widely accepted. It's a little bit easier to kind of low-key talk about being a game master than low-key talk about being a dungeon master.
That's a good point.
And also,
I didn't even think about that.
You might stumble across the wrong Craigslist ads back in the day.
On that note, we are going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back to talk about the rise of manga in the US and why you're hearing so much about it lately. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the show. We are here talking about manga and its rise in the US. It is really lucky that you brought up Dick Fight Island.
Oddly timely, one might say.
I can't say it without laughing just because it's such a ridiculous name.
It's they fight with their dicks.
I had the same thought. I don't know if you watch horrible reality TV on Netflix, but I got the ad for Fuckboy Island, and I had to giggle every time I saw it. I don't know why. It's just the rhythm of the name.
Oh, yeah.
The sheer ridiculousness of there being an island.
I definitely feel that vibe for sure.
But it is a manga, isn't it? Yeah.
100%. And apparently a very well-received one. So 5 out of 5 on Barnes & Noble.
On Barnes & Noble, that's right.
And 93% on Google. 93% of people liked this book. It's amazing. I can't stress enough.
I absolutely am delighted by this development, and I hope that it will continue. Kaylee, you knew this stat, but I want to tell you guys, listeners, in 2021, sales of manga in the UK were up an eye-popping 157% to £20 million. Now that's a stat from the UK, but I can't imagine that it's too different in the US. That 20 million pounds is about half of the entire graphic novel market in the UK. The entire graphic novel market was up to about £40 million in 2021, and that encompassed general graphic novels, superhero graphic novels, nonfiction and literary graphic novels, and manga. And manga was half of those sales.
Yeah, just dominated.
Absolutely insane. I mean, and I don't want to discount, because all of those other segments also had double-digit growth.
Yeah.
I mean,
like every segment, like last year, like growth in general.
And that was over 2016. So that's not just like a function of the pandemic. That is just several years of comics doing awesome. And mangas are comics. So if you, don't know what manga is, it's comics that are exclusively, or maybe not exclusively, but at least tangentially produced by and in Japan. It is a specific art and story style. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to define manga outside of just saying you know it when you see it. And I mentioned in our what we're reading section of this book that I'm reading, they also didn't have a definition for it, or the definitions that they had were just talking about some specific types of a style of panels, the way that the panels are situated and how the borders are kind of broken pretty constantly, and how American graphic novels don't do that. But again, it was a little bit old. I told this to Kaylee. The scholarship on manga is very old. It seems to have just It seems to have just stopped in the US around 2010. So a lot of my numbers outside of the business numbers that I just gave are kind of old, which is really annoying.
It seems that the people were just looking at growth as just a general matter of analysis that's been happening since the pandemic. They're like, well, what can we look at? Like, how are we doing? Like, what can we judge this by?
Yeah.
And just straight up figures and sales is kind of what they came up with for a lot of things.
Yeah, but we wanted to talk about how manga came to the US and its rise in the US. Now, there are a lot of theories about this. I found this lovely paper by Casey Brienza in Publishing Research Quarterly, and again, this is from 2009. So a lot of these numbers are out of date, but we can assume that they're at least relatively similar. 2009 wasn't that long ago, but it was a fair amount of time ago. Manga is provably avidly consumed by all segments of Japanese society, and in 1996, this paper cites the height of its popularity, and at that time it represented nearly 40% of all books and magazines sold in Japan. So this is a hugely popular market, or a hugely popular product. And it didn't really take off in the US until the beginning of the 21st century. There are tons of, theories about how and why manga came over. The GIs coming back from World War II, a lot of repressive attitudes in Japan, forcing bootleg copies over into the US. No one really knows for sure. Obviously, all we can really point to are business records. But we do know that manga sales grew 350% from 2002 to 2007. So we know that when it got here and started to get big, it got big.
It was like slow. And then it just continued. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill for sure.
And of course, we have tons of quotes from people working in the book-selling business at that time, being like, "We've never seen any kind of growth like this." And so that's kind of explains why your local bookstore has a manga section, most likely.
And it's probably larger than the comic section,
which is so. Though I will say, the trade paperback, the comic section are growing.
That is actually an excellent point. If you combine the two, and to be fair, manga is just manga. If you combined the two, they're probably going to be about the same or slightly larger in the trade paperbacks.
I think that if you combine manga and graphic novels, trade paperbacks together, they would probably be larger than the sci-fi fantasy section, which is where they usually are relegated 100%. if the whoever's organizing the bookstore doesn't quite know what to do with them.
That is accurate.
It's very funny. Every now and then I'll go into like a Barnes & Noble that hasn't been updated in a while, and you can't find the graphic novels anywhere. It's because there's no sign. They're just like one shelf in the sci-fi fantasy section. And no, even though like half of those graphic novels are not sci-fi or fantasy.
Not at all.
So there are probably about 10, again, as of 2009, major manga publishers in the US, and the main one is Viz Media. It is actually co-owned, or it was as of 2009, co-owned by two Japanese companies. And it is also referenced in this bookseller article because the vast majority of that growth in the UK market in 2021, 23 of the top manga titles in 2021 were from Viz Media. And you'd heard of Viz Media before.
Oh, yeah, no. So, Viz Media, they were one of the early adopters. So, the company, I can't remember their original name, Mix, I think, which has now become Tokyo Pop, was one of the others. And so they were one of the, and when I say one of the early ones, I don't mean like Astro Boy era, which is an interesting thing that Annie might have more details on, but I can just say that early, outside of one specific like title that was basically crowdfunded in like the 60s, when anime first came over, when manga first came over, they basically rewrote it from the ground up.
Really?
Yeah, so like Astro Boy was definitely like one of those titles people didn't know it was Japanese. They essentially genuinely just built it from the ground up again. And they did that with a lot of the early titles, and that might be part of the reason that it felt a little more samey and didn't maybe take off as much. I don't know, but you know, as it went, you know, that happened a little less. So, but yeah, so Viz was one of the ones that initially like they took the risk and started adding manga into like Borders back in the day when Borders was a bookstore.
Oh, R.I.P. Borders.
I know. I miss that. I miss Walden Books too. But yeah, so they took a pretty big risk, and like it just shot. I think that was probably one of the, because you exposed like when you had a kid was with their mom in the sci-fi fantasy section, and they're looking at the manga, and it just started going from there probably, exposing people to it like that, and it snowballed so fast.
It really did. So what Kaylee's talking about in the 1980s, when Astro Boy and Lone Wolf and Cub were first coming out, most of the people, as we were saying, a lot of these get mislabeled, misshelved into like the sci-fi fantasy because people aren't quite sure what to do with them. And even among manga fans, among Japanese people, they'll see a lot of manga as just, you know, something that's for little girls or little boys, similar to how people kind of see the comic book industry today, is like it's just for kids and it's not really that serious, or it doesn't have anything super, what do I want to say, risque.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Just saying, guys.
And then you give them, Dick Fight Island.
And then there's this.
And then they're like, wait a second.
Wait a minute.
This isn't for children. So around the 80s, actually, one of the reasons that Viz felt comfortable enough to take that risk and to make that change was because in the 80s, it was the rise of more cheaply produced comic books. So this paper from
constant.
Casey Brienza talks about the success of the 1984 self-published Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which I had not heard of before, but apparently is this like seminal thing where when that took off, there was a full bubble of small press black and white comics. And so these companies kind of saying, hey, well, there's already some IP. It's kind of expensive because we do have to do the translations and redo all the images and stuff, but it is cheap to produce because it's just in black and white. We don't need it to be in color. Up until this point, a lot of comic books were in color, and realizing that customers will buy it even when it's in black and white. And to this day, a lot of manga is in black and white because it's just much more cheap to produce.
I mean, and to be fair, like, it's kind of looking at it as a general, like, industry. You're always going to have the passion projects and that people are just devoted to, and to make the art as gorgeous as possible.
Yeah.
And not that there's anything genuinely wrong with going towards something that's a little cheaper, a little, you know, like just more accessible.
Yeah.
And the story itself can still be good and fantastic storytelling and art and like the lines, etc. It's just a different way of approaching the base art.
I think that was probably economically one of the reasons that it did so well initially, is because it was much cheaper. Much cheaper to produce in the 80s. Yeah, the recession in the 80s, probably. This paper does go on to talk about how, at first, Viz and the other companies tried to replicate comics publishing and the comics publishing format, publishing things in floppies, the issues once a month. But then realizing, this stat made me laugh a little bit. If they had tried to do that for some of these, specifically for Dragon Ball, it would have taken over 20 years to bring it out to market in its entirety, just releasing a couple pages at a time. So they were like, F that. And they just started releasing things in the actual
format.
What we would call trade books today.
I have to agree. What? No.
I know.
Thank God they figured it out.
Yeah, so we can talk a little bit about how it got jumping into bookstores. So basically, Viz was able to convince some bookstore managers to have entire manga sections. And that really fueled it because, you know, people were like, what is this? And then you kind of sit there and stand there and read the stuff. By the way, can I give you probably my favorite factoid of this whole thing?
Please, I would love you.
People crowded around the shelves reading the books instead of buying them. There's a word for it. It is called tachi yomi, and it means standing reading. And I thought that was the most charming thing I had ever heard.
That is great. I love it.
And Tony Johnson Woods, who edited that book that I referenced earlier, said, you would think that this would be frowned upon, but it's not. Just a quick visit to any manga section of any bookstore will show it.
It's just like being a library patron. Like, it's going to encourage people eventually to go to buy something. They're going to read enough that they're going to want to own it.
Yeah.
Or they're going to put it down and pick something else up that they could get more into.
And, I mean, nothing draws a crowd like a crowd.
You're a lot likelier to go into a restaurant that has at least a few tables full than to be totally empty.
Oh, that's true. I never even thought about that. But yeah, absolutely. Do you want to talk a little bit about the sexism here? Because it's going to be difficult for us to go much further without it. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I just got really sad. Just always... So, as we had talked about earlier, you've got a perception around manga, anime in general, but specifically a lot of the manga perception is that it's for kids or it's for girls. Japan even has certain words for it when you're a super fan, where it's like you're being mildly problematic about, not even mildly problematic about it. And you've got that here, and then there's a variety of ways to be sexist about how people engage with manga and with anime in general as well. So specifically, I'm going to be just generally more comfortable speaking to the fact that Western culture just over-sexualizes Japanese people massively, and it's specifically, it's going to be hitting ladies the hardest. 100%. There are statistics. I'm not going to quote them. You know what they are. Feel free to look them up, but it is an issue. It's a problem.
I mean, it starts from the earliest bits. I mean, some of the first manga ever released in the US was a tie-in to the Sailor Moon TV show. And when you start out appealing to teenage girls,
oh yeah,
you're gonna take a hit. I mean, we talked about
both
this.
Infantilization as well as over-sexualization, which is even worse.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, the infantilization is even more the issue, in my opinion. Well, I mean, they're both huge issues, but specifically around this one, because we talked about this earlier. We're talking about Nickelback and how people hate on Nickelback a lot. Why do they hate on Nickelback? It's not that they're bad songs. It's because... I
mean, they're no worse than any other pop songs.
Right. It's probably because most of those fans are women. Why do people hate on Twilight? Probably because most of those fans are women, and especially younger women. Anything that a younger woman likes or is passionate about, you're almost immediately going to see a lot of people coming out of the woodwork and saying, oh, well, this sucks. And the only thing that they can really point to is the fans.
Oh, yeah. Or they'll be like, oh, it's just stupid or whatever, or it was really juvenile. But, like, let me just be clear. Like, so were the Transformer movies, but you didn't get as much shit on that as you did for Jupiter Ascending. Right.
A lot of the manga magazines are specifically geared towards younger girls, and a lot of chain bookstores... I don't know if you remember this, but I have a very vivid memory of back in the day going to, I want to say it was a Walden Books, where they would limit the number of manga that you could buy at any given time as if it were all porn. As if, like, it was somehow damaging to young women.
No!
I know.
That's so stupid. I have taken genuine stacks of, and this is when I had, like, a gift card for $100. I've taken genuine stacks of sci-fi.
Yeah.
Fantasy novels up, like, actual
or romance
stacks.
Novels, maybe. Anything. But no, manga, no.
Manga was the problem.
It's so upsetting. And it's really difficult to talk about these things in American culture without addressing that, because it is such a large portion of the public perception of manga. I mean, before I ever knew anything about manga, that was my perception of it as well, because it's so ingrained in... pervasive is such a good word. Yes, it's pervasive.
At this point, like, it's so much more mainstream, but it's also part of its appeal is that it's niche, so it's going to continue to be marketed as niche, for better or worse, for probably a while, which is unfortunate, because it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be a divisive thing, and it's not for the most part. The worst elements of anything are being kind of condensed and then broadcasted loudly, largely through virtual forums. So unfortunately, that's kind of where you're at as far as some of the stuff that you hear. You can't base everything that you think about a media or a phenomena in culture off of the loudest voices on the internet. The problem is, I think, that it just takes so much longer for cultural perceptions to shift, because the people that are just kind of chill and sensible aren't shouting from the top of their lungs about them being chill and sensible. And they're like, oh, hey, manga's pretty cool, guys. It's just different stories and you come get some cool art. Like, they're just going to go about their business. And so it takes a lot longer for the cultural perception to kind of permeate with those updates. And so I think that the marketing and then again the trolls and stuff online are just going to continue to do what they do.
Troll's gonna troll. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing that people know most about manga, if they don't know anything else about it, is that they are so much smaller.
It's very tiny. Specific, like, and I think that was the other interesting thing as far as like to get people's attention. They're
that they
slightly
didn't look
larger than mass paperbacks.
Right, but they don't look like a comic book. It looks like something totally different. Yeah. I thought that was really, really interesting. So for those of you who maybe don't quite know what we're talking about, so your average manga book is about 5 by 7.5, which is significantly smaller than your average comic book, and also a different size than your average paperback. It's holdable in your hands. You don't need to use both hands. You can just walk and read. And I thought that was really interesting. So this article, I didn't find a ton of other discourse about this, but that is actually not how it's sold in Japan. That's an American thing. That's not entirely authentic, but that size helps keep it cheap in North America.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I know that they do, like, especially for serials, they'll have, like, weekly or bi-weekly
floppies. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But the books are different as well. I didn't know that.
And I think that adds a level of distinction to it. I don't know if you remember this, but there in the early days around this, like 2009, 2010 period of manga's popularity, we saw a lot of titles in just regular mainstream comic books, usually geared towards teenagers, but sometimes not, also being sold in that 5 by 7.5 format. I don't know if you read The Runaways as it was coming out.
Yeah, I did.
But it was in that smaller format.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I mean, obviously, the story wasn't really manga, but it was that size because they wanted to kind of appeal to that market, and that had a huge influence on, I would say, the teen market in that era. But that was the first, I would say, comic book that I read that was in that format, and that actually, it's so probably not what Marvel meant, but it did get me more into manga.
That's pretty funny. That's so weird. Like, how do you have money? Like, they've got a decent amount of money. Like, you can do, like, a little market research. The top 20 best-selling novels, what are the genres or whatever.
And I thought it was really
so weird.
Yeah, and my thought is, like, if they did that research and they're like, oh, well, a lot of the protagonists are teenagers, so it's supposed to be geared toward teens. It's like, a lot of your protagonists are teenagers too, so I don't know.
Like, what are you trying to say, right?
It's always so strange to me when people, like, make these generalizations and then, like, don't, like, take those 2 extra steps to be like, and what am I doing? You know?
No, self-reflection is the worst kind of reflection.
It's very difficult to do. It's hard. It's hard to do. I don't think that it's necessarily a coincidence that after, the manga companies rose and were solidified and found that releasing, issues/floppies was not a good business decision, that comic books kind of started to do the same thing. I mean, these days I only buy trades. I don't know about you. I feel like I always say I'm too old for floppies.
I mean, keep in mind, I don't know how much space was previously dedicated to advertising. In your floppies nowadays, there's
it's a lot of advertising.
A quarter.
It's weird.
Minimum of the book is just advertising.
Yeah.
And sometimes they'll add, like, stuff that's not necessarily advertising, but is still not the story. And it's sometimes fun stuff. I loved some of the stuff.
Yeah, well, they'll go...
They did, like, fan mail.
Well, yeah, that, stuff, and then like they'll have, like, sketches at the back of your average trade, or, like, some intros and stuff. So
they'll keep some of the cool stuff. Yeah. And so even that makes it into the trade. But, like, when you're looking at your weekly, monthly issue of a comic, and...
Right.
A quarter of it is ads. It's not the story. Like,
right.
Nobody likes that. Nobody's got time for that.
So I wanted to circle back to, you're talking about the Japanese culture. We talked about how, like, there is a weird feeling in American culture, fetishizing and fixating on Japanese culture. And I do wonder if that would have happened without manga.
Not to the extent that it has, but I don't think it's just manga. But I do think it's it's like the aggressive cross-contamination, the kind of idealized nature or imagined perception of Japanese culture that people get. We've talked about before, like, Paris syndrome. It's where if, like, Japanese people go to Paris and it's not the thing that they've imagined, that it's been built up in media and stuff, and they pass out. Like, it just shocks them. It's a shock to their system.
I had heard Paris syndrome was different. I'd always heard it was, like, just that depressed feeling that you get when you go to Paris and it doesn't live up to your expectations.
The most extreme is that they've
Pass
genuinely,
Wow.
they have to go. They're hospitalized.
I hadn't heard that this was like a specifically Japanese phenomenon.
It's not. The original, like the wider swath, and when I initially learned about it was that it was in reference to Japanese people specifically, just because of cultural consumption of media, and we share similar amounts of that consumption.
Right.
So it's not necessarily a unique phenomenon, but we go much harder than many countries, in my opinion. There's such a variety of fictions that we sell in books, kind of set up on a more of a pedestal because it's a combination of novel and art. And then you've got this foreign culture that you can just project anything you want onto. So like you've got your hyper masculine, like your berserk people, and you've got your hyper feminine, like the people that liked Sailor Moon. And people 100% have the wrong impression almost consistently about the country. And then how does that play out in their experiences with Japanese Americans or Japanese tourists or Japanese people they're just talking to online, you know? Like, it's rough.
I was watching a TED Talk recently. I'm going to butcher her name, but she talked about, she was an author who talked about stereotyping in literature. And she said, well, the main problem with stereotypes is not that they're wrong, it's that they're incomplete. It's one idea about a culture, and no culture can be encapsulated in one idea.
Yeah, nobody's only one note.
I mean, could you imagine if someone tried to import American literature and just imported our top literature, which, by the way, is historical romance? If they just brought that in, and that is some spicy book stuff. So if they just got that and were like, wow, Americans are so obsessed with bodice ripping and missionary sex and specifically Victorian era propriety, weird culture, that no, we're people, we contain multitudes.
Yeah.
We contain multitudes. Our lives are not encapsulated by our best-selling media. Our lives are not encapsulated specifically by historical romance. But that's the thing, like we can, bring in and say, oh, manga is the top genre in Japan, and it may genuinely be. I don't know anything about the Japanese market. I just did research on the US market, but my guess is that it's just a genre. It's just a genre, and it has a lot of different types of stories, different people to tell stories about.
They have light novels too, which are essentially just larger formatted novels that you would read.
So I definitely, as I was reading some of this cultural commentary, it kind of came back to me that, again, if we were going to judge an entire culture based on...
Judge not lest you be judged.
Right. Based on one media output, it would be very, very silly.
We also don't want that particular sword to be double-edged, fam.
And if you listeners have any interesting cultural commentary on manga, specifically in the US, obviously we always try to focus on the US because we cannot pretend that we are experts in anywhere else.
Sure. Like, we're not even experts here.
Yeah.
But, like, we got the home team advantage.
Yeah, we're not actually good at doing anything, so
guys, we just...
Anyway, again, shout out to Casey Berenzia and Tony Johnson Woods for the amazing analysis there. I don't have an author for that bookseller piece, so shout out to the Bookseller magazine in the UK.
Thank you.
I don't know why you don't list your authors, you
That's
jerks.
a silly choice. That seems short-sighted.
If you have anything you would like us to cover, or if you have anything you would like to add to this, you can reach out to us on Twitter, on Instagram. You can reach out to our email, theinksyncpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to the Ink Sync Podcast, the publishing podcast for the rest of us. I have been Annie.
I'm Kaylin.
See you next time.